All right, CJ. So today was a pretty monumental day for me. I finished the last installment in the Nietzsche lecture series for the Noetic website.
Congratulations.
Yeah, but what I always find problematic about switching between lecture installations and doing the podcast and things like that is that I get so zeroed in on the particular subject that I can't really see the grander narrative. And I didn't really have time to do a bunch of prep work for our podcast. So hopefully in the course of our conversation, the last third of the birth of tragedy will sort of be suddenly jogged within me as we talk.
And is that really like a hard thing for you sometimes? Because like you dive into these texts and you dive into these concepts, but then just to talk about them in this kind of back and forth sort of way is kind of difficult.
Sometimes if I didn't have you, it'd be very difficult because, like, for instance, today or the day before, I was very wrapped up in what Nietzsche had to say about opera.
Mm-hmm.
The people don't want to hear what I have to think about Nietzsche and opera right now, but we got to figure out how what Nietzsche had to say about opera fits into everything in general, which provides a great segue. And we're getting good at this whole radio thing.
You're very good, yeah. Well,
I just
continue.
All right, so do you remember? I did have a chance to review the tape from our last podcast, and do you remember we kind of divided it off so that we would talk about one major subject today. Do you remember where we cut it off?
I think we cut it off at the Socratic, right? Because we were kind of talking about the death of tragedy. Now we're talking about, now we're going to talk about at least what rises from the ashes of tragedy, or what takes its place. Yeah, what takes its place. So.
All right. So yeah, So when Nietzsche talks about tragedy killing itself, as poetical a phrase that is, he doesn't actually mean that like the art form went and grabbed a dagger and plunged it into its chest or whatever, even if that was somehow possible, which may be possible given this metaphysical conception of art, but we'll address that later. He thinks that there are two principal actors that ushered in the demise of this Apollinian Dionysian synthesis and replaced it. One person sort of replaced it with a bastardized form of tragedy, and another person sort of did away with the silliness of tragedy altogether in order to kind of build another archetype within Greek culture. And I'm leading you. Do you remember the two individuals?
Well, we focused on the first one, I know, last time. I can't remember.
A little bit.
Was it Euripides?
Yeah, Euripides.
Okay.
Yeah. So there was Euripides.
Yeah.
Nietzsche really has a problem with Euripides.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche also believes Euripides was given a lot of reinforcement, a lot of intellectual reinforcement from Socrates. Mm-hmm. If I recall, when Socrates went to the oracle or whatever, and he asked who were the wisest people in all of Greece, there was I didn't know this. I thought it was just Socrates, but apparently there was a gold, silver, bronze ranking, and it went Socrates, Euripides, and Sophocles. Mm-hmm. And he thinks it's not a coincidence that Euripides was the second wisest person in Greece, according to this oracle. But we'll get into that. So we have to ask first, like, why did Nietzsche have such a problem with Euripides? Do you recall what Euripides did to Greek tragedy that Nietzsche found so objectionable?
I don't remember, actually. I thought we talked about this last time.
We touched on it. We didn't get too deep into it.
I would imagine it has to be like something like you said, bastardizing tragedy, but I don't remember.
I think we said that much, but we didn't get down to the mechanics of it.
Yeah, I think I focused so much on Socrates.
Well, it has to do with that.
Yeah.
So the thing that Euripides and Socrates share is a certain mindset. They don't grasp the larger metaphysical aesthetic justification of life that the Apollinian Dionysian tension is. Mm-hmm. They can't make sense of it. And so Euripides, in Nietzsche's view, is going to try to make logical sense of the Greek tragedy, right? And trying to like borrow concepts and things like that. Mm-hmm. Try to clean it up and make it intelligible so that the narrative makes more sense. And this is going to ultimately involve getting people from their different walks of life to sort of come up onto the stage. It's kind of the sitcomizing. Is that a word? Sitcomizing? Or turning it into a sitcom of sorts, by bringing individuals up onto the stage and sort of acting out their normal lives. And they're not necessarily being this tragic art, and things are going to be more sane and manageable. And particularly what's going to make things more sane and manageable is that Euripides is sort of borrowing this Socratic understanding that there has to be a certain sort of justice and rationality to the world, right? That virtue and happiness will somehow be brought into harmony, where we don't see this in tragedy. Like, something is so tragic because it just like falls apart.
It just happens.
Like the guy's on the top of his game, and then suddenly he's getting poison in his ear, or like everybody's dead, and there's no resolve, and there's no real moral of the story or anything like that.
It's interesting you bring in the common man. That just makes me think that tragic characters are supposed to be larger than life or something. Or was that something that you're trying to articulate there?
Well, tragic characters, at least in the proper sense, with the Attic tragedy, what do we mean by larger than life, are really supposed to be manifestations
or a myth,
of the god. Yeah. So I think the big problem for Socrates for Nietzsche in regards to Euripides and his ally Socrates is that both of them are going to have this perspective that the play has to make sense, that it has to be rationally cognizable. And so that's going to like be really anti what emerges out of sort of the Dionysian abyss. And because it's more of a top-down approach where concepts are applied to actors and things like that, what's going to get minimized in this process?
Or at least it seems to me like I remember him making a comparison, at least, that one was emotion. Or at least like when he's talking about Dionysian versus the Apollonian, and like what tragic knowledge, like I guess when they try to make it, like you said, like a bastardized kind of like Euripides style tragedy, is that the ecstasy of the Apollonian just becomes not so much images but just thoughts.
Yeah.
And that the emotions become just affect, where it's just, if I pretend that if I just move my shoulder this way and I frown the certain way, that I'm going to look sad, that it isn't a genuine representation of sadness, that you can reproduce emotions in a certain way or reproduce feelings in a certain way. And that's something that definitely happened in music, especially turn of the I can't remember the century exactly, but this idea, there's this document called the Doctrine of Affections, which labeled out what certain musical things could be done to bring out a certain emotion. So it's almost like, to me, that you're kind of gritting this messy sort of world that we live in. And I don't know, maybe I went off too far.
No, that's precisely it. There is a gritting, there is sort of the schematization of the world or whatever. And what I'm trying to say here is that because of that, there's a suppression in time, because of the Socratic element. There's a suppression of an essential or a downplaying of the priority of a certain aspect of tragedy, of drama. And so we're saying that concepts are going to be played up, and Nietzsche's going to think that concepts are closer to the Apollonian, right? Versus, and they're universal with air quotes, right? Like, but there's a true universal for Nietzsche, right? Which is what?
This is the will, at least.
Right. Yeah. And the will is perfectly copied in what?
Right, in music.
In music. And so music is going to take more of a back seat with the emergence of playwrights like Euripides and Socrates whispering in his ear about how he's supposed to do it.
And that ties into why he hates opera, because it focuses on the words rather than the music.
Yeah. He's going to later on in the birth of tragedy, he's going to lament. We're skipping a couple steps.
That's okay.
And that's okay. But like, I'm trying to think, because I didn't really sort of schematize how we're going to have our conversation. But Nietzsche hates opera.
Yes.
And the reason why Nietzsche hates opera is that it's so driven by conversation. Mm-hmm. It's like, I'm going to the store today to get some milk. Who shall I see there? It's the butcher. I'm getting the milk. Well, no, I'm not. I'm the butcher. I'm getting you the meat.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like, it's like half sung talking, and he's just like, what is this nonsense? Like, it's getting at nothing really deep. It's just like everyday life set to tones and exciting music and things like that. It's all so the music is just kind of there to elicit some vague emotion.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, at least in the beginning, how you said like, okay, like people don't care about opera, but I think the idea behind opera is something that most people use when they listen to popular music or when they listen to song, is that sometimes the lyrics are more important than the music itself. So I think that kind of idea that Nietzsche is touching on is something that we all encounter daily. So maybe we're all Socratic in that way, or that we focus on the words and we're just like, like the words are important to me, like music, I don't really care. But like if it's a good message and really profound lyrics, and that's what I'm going for.
It tells kids to not do drugs.
Yeah, exactly. Or, it talks about heartache in a way that really appeals to me. So I think what Nietzsche touches upon is something that we can apply, or not apply to our daily lives, but at least we can see in our daily lives as something that we do.
I have no doubt in my mind that Nietzsche would have abhorred a great deal of modern music.
Sure.
After reading everything that I've read about the birth of tragedy. Yeah. I think just to fit all these pieces together, I think we just need to maybe explicate this arc a little bit more. So so we get talking about opera and modern music and why Nietzsche may hate it, but the way I think we just need to trace, how did we get from these earlier, happier Greeks who had tragedy or whatever to sort of cure them from their existential problems or whatever, to this point where we get these art forms that Nietzsche thinks are going to be absolutely terrible.
Right.
And there's going to be a certain mindset that is going to come to predominate. And he talks about there being three different points of view, really. Three different archetypes. I don't know if you recall.
I recall, because they each kind of touch upon one of the aspects that we're talking about. So we have the Apollinian, which I believe is the... Well, let me start at least with the Dionysian, which is the Buddhist, if I recall. Or no.
So I understand them like this.
Okay, go.
I understand them like this because they all involve different... He says they all involve these elements, but it's going to be a matter of proportion.
Okay.
So
there's like the three ingredients, and then each of them takes it. Okay.
So there's going to be Alexandrian culture.
Okay.
There's going to be Hellenic culture, and there's going to be tragic culture.
So the Alexandrian then is the one that focuses more on the Socratic.
Yes. So Socrates from Alexandria, like the Library of Alexandria, the man, the theoretical man, the man of knowledge, right? Right. Knowledge in air quotes. Hellenic
is going to be the tragic, or at least the Dionysian.
I think it's going to be in my understanding of it, I think that's going to be what he sees as the synthesis. The tragic. The Hellenic scenarios where we get Greek tragedy.
Okay. So
then the tragic is going to be what he calls it the tragic man is also going to be the Buddhistic.
Right. And well, it's like Schopenhauer, that idea that he takes like the Veil of Maya and that how all that covers
precisely. So we can. So if the Hellenic is like this proper distillation of the Apollinian and the Dionysian, but we know it doesn't stay that way. He talks about it being this like plaything, this miraculous plaything that only lives for a short period of time, and Socrates is ultimately going to be the thing that destroys it. And we've already talked about this. Socrates destroying it to a certain degree because he tries to make it all sane and rational and downplay music. But in general, Socrates gives rise to a general sort of philosophical point of view. And I'm sure you could expound on that. Was
it Socratic aestheticism, or is there a certain name to it, or... I'm trying.
Socratism, scientism.
Where reason is the main idea, and I think I remember him talking about it. How it had this optimism that we could solve anything, or that we can find out whatever about the world as long as we use our intellect and our rational judgment. And to me, it's interesting that you bring up at least a while back, you're talking about how tragedy is almost this. Existential, or it's trying to alleviate the Greeks of this existential problem, where it almost seems like Socraticism is also a means of relieving this existential problem of, well, the world's just will, but we can solve it through reason. But to Nietzsche, it's immoral and wrong. So I guess that's what we're trying to talk about.
Nietzsche's going to say that the Alexandrian, the Alexandrian, the Hellenic, and the tragic insight, these are all different ways of dealing with the abyss.
Okay.
All right? So they're all going to be different forms of illusion. It's like choose your illusion. Was that a Guns N' Roses record?
Oh, maybe.
Use your illusion.
Though the interesting thing, I guess, what you're saying too is that for the Socratic, he believes in the illusion. He doesn't know it's an illusion, like a tragic person
he thinks he knows things.
Right.
And so that's why he thinks the later Greeks, they adopt this Socratic point of view and they become cheerful, but which he thinks is kind of like senility. This sort of like delusion, like, oh yeah, I can totally know the whole world and things like that.
So what did he say of Socrates in his famous "I know nothing"? Is that also knowing that? Is that also knowledge, or is it just like I know?
Which
everything?
which is really strange.
Yeah.
He doesn't talk about that.
No, that's what I thought was interesting. Where it's just like maybe he thought that twoism was kind of an optimism, where it's like you still know something, but you're just like, well, I don't know anything about the world, but I think maybe I can know something if I just try.
This is really interesting to me, and I think you could really write a dissertation or a master's thesis about this, is that the character of Socrates is really interpreted so differently by so many different philosophers. Like, Socrates is a huge part of Kierkegaard's writing, but the Socrates of Kierkegaard's writing is the all I know is I know nothing guy. Like he's the one. There isn't any sort of optimism to that Socrates in Kierkegaard's writing. It's a resigned, ironic figure. In Nietzsche's writing, Socrates knows everything and believes that he can teach everybody everything. And then there's obviously Socrates, maybe even just sort of what we think Socrates is what we largely get from Plato. He's a manipulation.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
There's Plato too. Yeah.
And I'm sure Hegel's going to have his own interpretation of Socrates.
And I can almost think of the skeptics or this idea.
A lot of people put a lot of words in Socrates' mouth. A lot of people use Socrates to their own ends. And that was and perhaps this is a good critique of Nietzsche, is I don't know about, check me wrong, I don't recall him mentioning that he was the wisest because he didn't know anything. No. He's conveniently left that out. And that's like the big thing about Socrates, right?
I remember him bringing it up, but I don't remember what he took from it. Maybe we're putting words in Nietzsche's mouth, where maybe we're like, well, he says nothing, but I remember that.
I feel like I would have come across
somewhere.
it.
Yeah, I thought I remember it somewhere, but
I read it pretty closely.
I know you did, but yeah. That's an interesting part. Yeah, I don't know that.
Yeah, but
how fitting.
it's a big part of Kierkegaard's Socrates, and it's not a part of Nietzsche's as much. But that aside, he thinks that this sort of cheerful optimism that we can know everything through reason or whatever is the result of was born out of Socrates and Kim sciences, and he thinks that this worldview ultimately comes to predominate, right? And that's why he thinks it's no coincidence that if we were living underneath a scientific perspective, that opera at that time should be the dominating art form.
Right.
But it'd be really interesting and I think maybe we can, if we do another one of these, to sort of like, how does Nietzsche apply to today? Sort of podcast. I'd like to get us thinking about the noise music we make in the basement, the pop music we've both made, the pop music that's popular right now, and the future of music and what it says about rebirthing tragedy and whatnot. I think that'd be really interesting for us to prognosticate and speculate. But he says that as Socratism sort of comes to dominate, we get this sort of delusional cheerfulness, like kind of like when kind of the eccentricity of someone like when they're going to die. Like I likened it to a grandpa that performs magic tricks. It's like they don't really have anything to live for anymore, but they can still kind of divest themselves in frivolity.
That's the whole idea of the dying Socrates, right? Where you have that whole dialogue, and I know he talks about the whole idea of the dying Socrates and how he made music.
Right.
Music making Socrates. So.
Yeah, so there's a negation of life somehow. This sort of choosing this illusion of schematization.
Well, it's interesting you say negation of life, because isn't the Dionysian almost negate. Well, maybe it's not a negation of life per se, but it is almost a kind of destruction of it. I don't know. Do you think it is a negation of life, or is it just trying to veil life? I'm talking about the Apollonian, at least, or I'm sorry, the Socratic. Yeah,
I think he thinks that the Socratic is a negation of life in the sense that the Socratic demands for the world to be rational and ethical, and a rational ethical world requires sort of individuation or whatever. And when Nietzsche's talking about Socratism being potentially life negating, it's ultimately going to be denying the thing that's animating all of life, which is the Dionysian will. It's like trapping us in this illusion that I am Luke and that I'm responsible and I'm the one making the choices and I'm the one making the art and I'm the one doing the thinking. But in the reality of the situation is I'm just a temporary percolation or something like that of that Dionysian will. But we can't... The science man, the Socratic man, is able to distract himself with logic and concepts from that reality to an extent.
Yeah.
What did you do? There are sort of two scenarios that happen, because the Socratism is not limitless. The science is not limitless.
Yeah, go into that. I'm curious.
Well, I think he says that science. I can't remember the reverberations of it, but that science will ultimately reach its edge, right? Its edge of knowledge. We see this today, like where we have people saying with a great deal of certainty, I'll take this bowling ball and release it, and it'll come back, and it'll be in the exact same place, and it won't bludgeon my face in and stuff like that, because I believe so much in the laws of physics. Cool. But then there's a lot of things about physics that we have no real understanding of, and you see this in the battle of string theory and quantum physics and who's going to win out and all of that. So we're reaching the edge of the scientific knowledge. And so I think Nietzsche is going to say that the Socratism is ultimately going to go on a trajectory where it has to stare into that abyss again. And rather than turn towards what could heal it, tragedy or whatever, it's going to deal with that, somehow it's going to get involved with frivolity and intoxicants and things like that. Something to sort of distract it. Now you really get to any sort of substance or whatever. And I think that sort of makes sense in the modern worldview, but Nietzsche claims that. We can tease that out some more.
Sure, but that's almost like Goethe's Faust, right? Where it's just like, I've learned, for Faust, learns everything, so he has to make a deal with the devil to compensate for just knowing everything.
He doesn't make a second deal. I thought he made the deal with the devil to learn everything.
Maybe that's the second deal. I thought he learned everything, and he's just like, I need more knowledge. Or
Faust is a figure like Socrates that has been interpreted. Yeah. So it depends on whose Faust we're talking about.
Oh, sure, if it's man's Faust or Goethe's Faust.
Yeah. So they're going to be different Faust stories, just like they're going to be different Socrates stories.
Sure, but I think that still lies in the fact where is knowledge or Socraticism at its limit, though, which I think is what we're talking about. So at least that's why
does Faust despair when he knows everything?
I don't know.
I think he does, because Kierkegaard's very obsessed with Faust as a character as well, to sort of illustrate the existential limits of knowledge. But I digress a little bit from that. But the other thing, he's actually thought there were some German geniuses that were able to anticipate the limits of the scientific Socratic worldview. And he names two of them. Do you remember who they are?
This is like a class. You're just like, can you tell me what to do?
I'm sorry. Yes, I just I don't do all the talking.
No, I understand. No, I remember him talking. I mean, the person he's talked about before, Schopenhauer, and then he also names Kant.
Yes. They possessed, on Nietzsche's view, what he calls the tragic insight.
Sure.
So we've talked about the Alexandrian and Socratic man. We've talked about the Hellenian and the Dionysian Apollonian synthesis, and we've talked about the tragic insight and how much and he calls that Buddhistic, which I thought was strange.
Well, I think it makes sense though, because
how does that make sense?
I think at least Buddhism, at least one of the tenets, is a knowledge that the world is suffering, or that the world if we're going to translate back to Nietzsche, the world is Dionysian, and that the world is the will. So
and that there are no individuals.
Yeah.
In the world, we are all temporary manifestations of this thing that will be subsumed back into it. Right. Exactly. Now, whether or not that's a correct understanding of Buddhism.
No, I don't know.
I don't know if Nietzsche was a Buddhist scholar and could really say that.
Let alone Schopenhauer, a Buddhist scholar. But yeah, no, I think that knowledge, I think maybe to him, I think was important, or that's probably why he called it Buddhistic.
Right. And so I think he was hopeful that Germany, and I think this would be interesting to see how, and I think last time I mentioned this, that he was hopeful, like he talks about the Übermensch and something. I wonder, he seemed hopeful, given that German figures like Kant and Schopenhauer. I know Kant was technically in Austria, or I don't know the geographic lines. He spoke German.
Yeah, Austro-German.
Whatever. Kant was Prussian, wasn't he? Königsberg. Where is that? Who cares? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
He's German to us.
Yeah, he's German to us. Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche himself, Wagner.
Yeah.
These individuals grasped the tragic insight. And I think he was hopeful that the German people could possibly, if they got their act together, could resurrect or rebirth what the Greeks got right with the Dionysian and Apollonian synthesis back in the early Hellenic days. Mm-hmm. So it's not enough to really have the tragic insight, but then you got to go back and sort of marry these aesthetic elements to get that together. So that's why they're all sort of, that's kind of how the Hellenic gives way to the Socratic gives way to the tragic, and the tragic could potentially maybe give back to the Hellenic.
Yeah, and that's great that you bring that up, because that kind of brings it back to, like, why is Nietzsche writing about this stuff? Because he's trying to, bring Germany back, it's almost a cultural text where he's like, I'm going to try to bring back Germany, or we're going to try to bring back Germany, or bring back culture, or civilization back to its glory days, and we have to use something as a platform, or at least a kind of guideline, because I think when he's talking about Socraticism and reason, it's just like, that takes away myth altogether. So if you don't have myth or something that you're striving for, like the Greeks did, or some kind of figure, you're just going around trying to, let's say, like, oh, what's this made of? What is this made of? Oh, what's my nose made of? Like, that's what I thought this was a really fascinating point that he made about Socratism and science and stuff like that. We tend to think about the limitless yearn for knowledge as being like a good thing in man or whatever. But he actually says that it's more like people that have been starved, which I thought was this really fascinating point. The fact that I'm constantly reading philosophy texts and talking about stuff like that, it's like, it indicates that I don't have the myth to set me straight. So I'm just foraging through the garbage of other tossed off myths in order to find something, and like nothing ever satisfies. There's nothing there anymore. And I think he thinks that modern man is more like this ravenous hog. Oh yeah.
Than the cultured Renaissance man that people want to angelize.
Or even the Renaissance man, is the bad guy. And you want to bring it back to like Kierkegaard, how he immortalizes like Socrates, but also Abraham. This kind of what some people would consider stupid or just kind of guy, but he had this covenant with God, and that sort of just made him go forward and do all these things, where it's like sometimes that leap of faith is needed into myth, whether that be for, religion or this Dionysic or myth in general. But it's interesting. I'm rambling. But
No, it's totally, I think it was interesting is that that Kierkegaard will place, in his sort of stage theory, will place Abraham ahead of Socrates. God, there are so many parallels between Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and completions of thought. Like, I would have loved to have gotten them in a room together. But I thought was really funny, going back to your point, I thought this was one of the more humorous parts of the text, was So, we early on, when we first introduced this text, we dwelled on Nietzsche's embarrassment over the writing of this book. He thought the language was like kind of silly and bombastic. And I think when you and I had done our first read-throughs of it, we were like, oh, Nietzsche, you're being too hard on yourself. Yeah. And I was telling you, we were in the kitchen earlier, and I was talking to you about, I'm like, okay, I understand why Nietzsche, I was like, I think I understand why Nietzsche was embarrassed of this text, because towards the end, he starts talking about how Germany could possibly rebirth tragedy and stuff like that. And he's like invoking, he's using all these crazy Germanic metaphors, like, and then the then Broomhilda shall rise again and slay the dwarves. And I'm just like, did I suddenly get sucked into a Dungeons and Dragons game? Like, what the hell is happening here? Do you remember the language?
No, I remember that.
We're talking about fire-breathing dragons and stuff like that. I'm like, oh, this is where role-playing games came from.
No, but then again, that is German myth, and I think that's why he likes Wagner so much, besides the idea that he draws, that music is the main part of it, is that most of his operas, his musical dramas, not operas, are based on German myths and folklore. So, again, maybe that's the myth of the Germans. Is that? Yeah, I know. It just felt like
it just felt like a role playing game, don't you?
Sure, no, but again, that's their myth. I mean, if it was somebody else, if it was a Greek, he'd be using all these metaphors relating back to the gods and the demigods and all that stuff. So
makes me want to study German myth, because I think there's probably a lot more beauty to it than I'm giving it credit. I know that because as a result of, I don't really think a lot of Greek ruins, but I know this is the result of reading the rebirth of tragedy, or reading the birth of tragedy, and doing this lecture series. I've become really fascinated with sculpture, like anything that was like Greco-Roman or whatever. Like and 36 years, I've never really cared about that type of sculpture. But when I started to think about these sculptures as being manifestations of the Apollonian dream scene, I'm like, okay. And like when I started to understand the significance of like a satyr or a tragic hero bust or something like that, I'm like, oh, okay, this is taking on entirely new significance.
No, that's such a great point, because that's what this text I think is partially about too, is just kind of a education, if not saying a re-education, or almost like a renaissance again of like trying to bring back trying to bring back Greek culture just as they did back in the Renaissance, and trying to rediscover it again. Granted, not in a Socratic way of like, oh, what did Aristotle know? What did Plato know? I'm going to try to get all the knowledge, but in a sense of, oh, well, let's see what is really at the bottom of their worldviews and of their art, which was what Nietzsche's trying to do, and what he does really well, and makes you, again, like think and look at their art differently, and makes you look at everything differently, which is kind of the point of a text like this.
Maybe I could fall back in love with like certain aspects of German culture that have been sort of permutated to become kind of a caricature of it. So I think I could understand it a little bit better. So I'm wondering, have we covered most of what the end of the book was? I mean,
I think we did.
I think we kind of have. I mean, and there at the end, he's going to drive home the point that all this Socratism and all this other stuff misses the deeper wisdom of the Apollonian Dionysian play, and that really the only justification for life is not going to be a rational one. It's not going to be an ethical one. It's ultimately going to be an aesthetic one. And that, like, the way that man makes sense of his world, feels at home in his world, on an individual level, is going to be through this play of these Apollonian and Dionysian impulses. But also, like, the world, this larger world soul, or whatever we want to call it, is ultimately, you want to say reconciled? I don't know what to say. Like, and this is something that like is really maybe another source of embarrassment for Nietzsche. I'm not sure. We'll have to see how he develops his metaphysics and other texts down the road and stuff like that. But there does seem to be this larger metaphysical narrative that there are forces, larger forces, and seemingly intelligent forces that are battling it out in the realm of man. So that on an existential level, man is made as right as he can with the world with the Apollonian Dionysian tendencies, but really all of the world is just playing out of this stuff.
Yeah,
so okay, we've read the entire book. I've lectured on the entire book. We've talked about the entire book. Is that idea crazy? I mean, and what's strange about it is it's really not too different from other religious anthropologies, right? Like of God and the devil, Dionysus and Apollo, or this cosmic battle of things,
chaos and order. Well, granted, yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting too because, at least for me, I always think in a sense of chaos and order, but not of a middle, or I guess chaos and order and everything else in the middle, but. I think maybe I was thinking, at least in Nietzsche's term, I guess I was thinking of the Socratic and of the Dionysian, but I never really thought of the Apollonian, which is interesting. I mean, that's one part that I took from this text. I was like, oh, I didn't really know that could also be something where it's not necessarily reason for reason's sake, but it's just these images. And how do you, I mean, granted, I'm still kind of lost of like, how do you articulate that? What is Apollonian and what's Socratic? Where I feel like those two can almost kind of be mistaken for each other sometimes. So I don't know, that was something interesting for me that I took from. But yeah, I mean,
do you think it's a good book?
Do I think it's a good book? I don't think my opinion really matters of whether it's a good book or not. But
do you feel transformed by it at all? Like, I guess I think it's I haven't really thought about it a lot, but I think it's a fascinating book. And
that could mean so many things. That someone's just like, oh, it was fascinating, but I didn't really take anything from it. You know what I mean?
Oh, I can't tell. I feel like it's equal parts. There's some stuff in there that is so boldly asserted and so implausible, but then there's some stuff in there that seems to ring so true.
Well, that almost sounds like a lot of old science stuff, like before the Enlightenment, like before that, where they just made these bold assertions like crazy, and some of them rang true, but some of them were just such hogwash today. If we read them, we just say like, you're actually saying that with utmost authority that Earth revolves around nothing, but everybody revolves around the Earth, like stuff like that. But I think that to me is what lends some of its kind of interest, in the sense that he's just going for it. He's kind of just going in the dark. He's just in a room, pitch black, and he's trying to just find his way, find a light, or at least make a light. And I think it's interesting when we read a text, and that it's almost as if they have kind of found the light, and they sort of made their own little light, whether that be a fluorescent light or maybe like a little candle light. And then we walk around and say like, oh, you didn't see that chair there? Why'd you hit that chair? You didn't see this? You didn't see that? Yeah. And of course that's with hindsight, because we know everything that somebody didn't know. So I feel like...
Does our hindsight say that... So does our hindsight say that there's something really problematic about this text?
Well, at least Nietzsche's hindsight did in some way. Granted, it was a lot of stylistic concerns, but
I mean, I learned so much from this text. I learned so much about mythology and classics and stuff like that, and it's really hard to disagree with him about how music and plastic art images should be judged and thought of differently, as possibly arising from different places. I think that's a pretty fertile area of research. About the metaphysical justification.
Well, that's what I mean. That's the part. That's the part where it's just like he's just kind of going for it, and you're just like, "Are you serious, Nietzsche? Like you just ran into that like full front, just like
yes." Oh yeah, he says like we're just gonna jump right into it. He says
right.
I'm not gonna beat around the bush.
Yeah, he's gonna go in the room without any lights on and just like find his way around, and just like fuck it, like I know what I'm doing. And
what other parts of it did you like?
Did I like?
So I liked his depiction of where music comes from. I liked his depiction of where images come from.
Oh man, as a musician, I guess his whole thing was just like, music's the best. That is the highest art. I think is really cool. Granted, I would be really curious to know at least how he's so positive about Wagner, and then he bashes him. I know he has a text.
Yeah, I would love to know how he makes.
He has a text about that, or at least it's like against Wagner. I can't remember what the exact title is, which maybe we could do next, or we can look into. But then he goes and says that he likes composers like Georges Bizet and Jacques Offenbach, who are opera.
Are they?
Composers, right. Like, most of their output is in operettas or opera. So it's really interesting for him to say, like, oh, Wagner's the best. And then, like, nah, I'm going to just listen to kind of just opera.
See, this was...
Like, he said, like, he bashes opera and then he listens to it.
Yeah, this was one of the problems for me with Nietzsche, is that there weren't a lot of specifics. Is that, you know... I still don't know what true Dionysian music sounds like.
Sure, yeah. There's no method, yeah, because that's kind of the next thing. It's like what can we do, or like how can you practice being Dionysian?
Yeah.
Like, can you practice? I mean, Apollonian. Can you practice tragedy?
So I don't know what Dionysian music sounds like, and I don't know. Like I said, like if Wagner is an instantiation of this potential. A resurrection of the Dionysian. What precisely was Dionysian about Wagner, and why is Wagner different from Bach? Now you could speak more to that than I could. I don't know what the, and then also he makes a lot of, like, when he talks about Socratism and science as if individuals are like one thing or the other, like they can't be. Like, that there were no scientists who played music, or no philosophers that played music. I mean, Nietzsche himself is a music-playing philosopher.
Yeah, or even musicians who focus heavily on science and rational base. At least, like, talking about, like, serialist composers who made music almost a science in themselves, or they had to give some kind of intellectual foundation to what they were doing, so that other sciences and so that they could be taken seriously, at least like academically. So yeah, that is very interesting, and I think to his credit, he kind of sets up those different points of view, and I think it's interesting how he at least says that. So you have the Socratic, you have the Apollonian, you have the Dionysian, and here's some different cultures, but they're all part of these three cultures, but they're each in a different way, or they each have like a different kind of recipe, at least, into how they create.
I'm trying to think of a metaphor for how I feel about this text. Trying to think.
Keep it PG.
I will.
No, I don't know.
You see, so like when I was a kid and I would go to the beach. Like we would have like molds, maybe, like, and like the mold provided like some general contours to the sand. So like you could like put it on top of the sand and press it down in there, and like it may make like, I don't know, like like a fish. It may make the imprint of the fish on the sand or something like that, right? And I feel like that's kind of what this book does, is it makes a general imprint, but it can't really get into any sort of hyper-focused detail. It can't make this like perfect rendering of like, oh my God, there's a fish on the sand. Because there are certain constraints to this these contours or whatever. And then I also feel like this contour that has been pressed upon the sand can be washed away by
exactly.
the wave.
As I was saying, that's the will. I think, at least that's what I was about to say. Where it's just like, that's the will. Where it's like anything, and I think that's interesting too, in the senses where it's just like anything you do is just gonna be wiped away.
So it's like it's almost like this sand castle. Or sandfish. Let's call it a sandcastle. That's more poetic. This sort of crude sandcastle that he has made. It's like, wow, Nietzsche, you made a sandcastle. Sandcastles are hard to make. And then like we subject it to scrutiny. We're the wave, and then we just wipe it all out.
Or we're just the people walking around and looking at them, saying, "Oh, that's a cool sandcastle." And sometimes we think the sandcastles will last forever, or at least we suspend our belief that these sandcastles are going to die away real soon, and that we.
Do you think every philosophical system is a sandcastle?
I think if we use another sandcastle to judge the other sandcastle, if we use Nietzsche's text and his metaphysics, I would say yes. And maybe that's what he was talking about when he was bringing up Schopenhauer and Kant, where Kant critique of pure reason, and Schopenhauer saying like just being the pessimist that he is, that at the end of the day, we, like Socrates, we don't know anything, and that we are nothing. And to quote that little
now everybody's gonna go kill themselves.
well, no, see, this is where art comes in, and that's kind of the optimism and myth. So that's where the optimism comes in, is that okay,
we just became the melancholy scientists.
Right. Well, yeah, that's where the optimism, at least.
And we got to go in the basement and reconnect with the Dionysian.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I think we do touch a lot on the fact that this text is quite depressing, but the hopefulness, at least in my sense, and maybe I'd be curious to see like how you feel this text is optimistic, but in the sense that that art is a means of living with this world and bearing it. And I think a lot of people, philosophers, artists, touch upon this point, but it's equally interesting. And again, I use interesting so many times in this conversation, but it's fascinating to see how Nietzsche articulates art as this means of bearing the world.
So we need art. So now you and I have reached a sort of melancholic conclusion about this text. I'm wondering why I spent 50 or so hours putting the lecture series together, why we've talked about it, and I'm just like, damn it, like, it's all going to get washed away. The thought system isn't going to be substantive. I'm feeling deflated. And ultimately, we have to come back to the real penetrating insight that Nietzsche offers up is that art is there to heal us. That's and not Apollinian art, like true sort of eruptions from the Dionysian.
Exactly, yeah, and with that we can't, and then we have to know that anything that we do, whether it be art in the sense of Apollinian or of Socratic, that it's all an illusion, or at least that if we know that those are images, then we can at least have that knowledge and use them to our advantage to at least bear the Dionysian and to have that kind of interplay between the two. And then maybe I have just like one more question or food for thought is if you took the Socratic as the Apollinian, if you knew that reason was an illusion, then is that Apollinian? Or can you use reason in that sense if you know that, well, reason isn't really going to be the guiding viewpoint of my life, but I'll use it anyway in my art, and it'll almost kind of be image making. I don't know. That's just a thought, but
I mean, the understanding that reason is an illusion. I think he would. I mean, I think that he says that's part of the tragic insight. And then where one goes from there, I think he leaves it open where one goes from there because he's still kind of waiting for what Germany will produce. He's confident that Germany will do something because he sees reformational figures like Luther do some really sort of heroic things. He's just kind of waiting on somebody. Maybe he thought it was him that was going to do it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, at least if I want to end on a metaphor, and I think you just said it, and now I'm just extending on it. It's almost if this text for me is like Nietzsche pushing me off a cliff. Like he's kind of just gotten me started, and that I'm falling. And maybe it's an endless abyss, maybe it's not, but through his insight, I am supposed to grow wings and kind of fly back up, or maybe I'll just keep falling and that sort of thing. But this text to me is almost just kind of like, okay, this is what the world is. Good luck.
Good luck.
You're falling. You're just like, maybe I'll grow wings, and like maybe the Apollinian will help me grow wings, or maybe I should just keep falling because that's a Dionysian. I don't know, but to me, like texts like these, and like whether that be art or music, where some of this stuff just kind of kicks your ass, or just like kicks your ass off a cliff, and you just keep going down.
It is like getting shoved off a cliff.
Yeah. So maybe you want to end on that.
Yeah, we will. Yeah. That was good, man. 50 minutes. All right. Cool. I don't know what we'll do next time. Maybe Schiller. maybe
we'll find out.
We'll figure it out. We don't have to know.
Thank you all for listening. I appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.